Hello, class. I had a very enjoyable time reading your first drafts. There are some very interesting ideas floating around, and I think the papers have a lot of potential. What I'd like to do today is to give you some tips and tricks to up your game, if you will, on your first draft so that your revised draft is the best it can possibly be. I realize that some of you are rising seniors in college. It may have been a while since you've been in a composition class. You may not have taken a class before, a literature class, where you have to write this kind of argument. Or if you did, it was back in high school and the argumentative focus wasn't there. Or some of you may have AP tested out of freshman English. And so this may be your first encounter with college writing. So for that reason, I want to kind of go over some basics and then also give you some kind of more advanced tips. Okay, first thing is just looking at this paper. Right off the bat, I'm happy as a professor because there's an MLA heading and a title. And that sounds really cheesy, but it's just kind of like, hey, the student knows to apply the MLA formatting. I know who the paper is by right away. I can see that it's for my class, and they have a title. Now, some people don't have titles yet. Some people's titles are basically literary analysis essay. And some people have gotten a little bit more specific and said, say, Twelfth Night analysis, but none of those titles really helps the reader out. Think of the title as the first impression to your paper. And so I want to be specific, and I want to give the reader a preview of the subject matter. And I want to be as narrow as possible without actually writing a sentence. Now, I have a kind of cutesy title here. I've got some alliteration going on here. It sounds very dramatic. There's this colon. That's just kind of something that I like to do. I don't always, I'll be honest, I don't always have the inspiration to write a cutesy title. This one kind of came with as a flash of inspiration. And so I do not want you to angst about the beauty of your title. I just want you to be specific. So if I had not, been inspired with this title, what I could have done is said love versus friendship in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, or Viola as friend in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, or something like that to give my reader a preview of what the paper will be about. So I just wanted to point that out to you, that a lot of you have some kind of rather vague titles or no titles at all. Now, some of you do have great titles, so if you're thinking to yourself, oh, I thought my title was specific, you're probably right. But remember, this is a general purpose kind of lecture. Now, if you were like me when I was younger, I always felt very kind of insecure about my introductions. I always felt cheesy writing them. I was always just trying to really, really grind out a couple of sentences before I could get to my thesis. And then I felt like I was on solid footing. And then I knew what to do. I would go to town on my body paragraphs. This is understandable, because when we're younger, we're in high school, we're in junior high, we don't really usually get a lot of instruction on how to write an introduction, unless your experience has been unusual compared to the students I've had before. Now, part of this is because the high school English teachers have a lot of other things that they need to teach you, and introductions don't jump up there to the top of the priority. So don't be mad at them. But now here you are in a sophomore level literature class, and so I'm going to talk to you about what an introduction should do. An introduction has a very, very important job in your paper, and that is to build motivation for your thesis. Your thesis, even though it's a literary analysis and not a persuasive paper about a policy decision or something like that, it still needs to create a sense of significance to the audience in order for it to work as an argument. So how do we do this? It's a 4-part structure that begins with a hook or an attention-getting device, or a prelude, if you will. Then it goes on to some shared context. Then you problematize the context, and then that creates the motivation for your solution to the problem, which is your thesis. So let's talk about what's going on in my example paper structurally, and then you can think about applying it back onto your own introduction. All right. So I start this paper off with what's called an epigraph, or a short quote at the beginning of the paper. And you see it has a little bit of a special formatting. So if you find yourself wanting to put an epigraph in or draw onto this kind of way of opening, go ahead and make sure you follow this formatting. You'll see that the margins are pulled in and it's single spaced. It's kind of floating there in between the title and the beginning of the actual paper. Now, when I give this lecture to my composition classes, a lot of my students really latch on to the epigraph, which I can understand why. It used to be one of my favorite ways to start a paper, and I've used it here. There are other ways that you can start your introduction. You could ask some rhetorical questions, although if you do that, make sure they're specific. You could start with an interesting fact or statistic, or you could lay out a puzzling scenario for your reader. That gives your reader something to think about and use something to write about right away. Oftentimes students in the past, if they haven't really studied how to write introductions or they haven't been given instruction on how to do them, they kind of relapse into some kind of old, tired tropes that you want to avoid in a college paper. So one that is very common, and don't feel bad if you've done this because I have too, is the dawn of time introduction. So that's when you start off with something like, people have always suffered for love, or poets have been writing about love for centuries, or some kind of, really vague statement that doesn't really have much punch behind it. Now, the reason that you do that, and it's okay, I'm not judging you, I do it too, is that you're kind of doing the equivalent of clearing your throat in your writing. You're just trying to get started. So if you find yourself in papers that you write for other classes after this, writing these kinds of beginnings, what I would advise you to do is just keep writing them because they're helping you to get started, and then go back when you're reading through your work and delete them because they really aren't of much value. Another thing that is particularly annoying to me, it's just like a little pet peeve, and I won't get mad at you if you have done this, but just so you know, is the dictionary definition. Please don't do that. That's a very popular thing to do in like high school speech class. So we want to avoid that. Vague generalizations, book report type information that doesn't have anything to do with your specific topic. And then the other thing that some of you have done, and I'm not mad at anyone, I'm just kind of pointing this out, is giving a lot of general background information on the piece of writing without really giving the right kind of background information to get to your argument. So just kind of really interrogate the stuff that you have at the first few opening sentences. The nice thing about an epigraph is that it gives you something to close read right away. And you do want to refer to it in the first few sentences of your paragraph. You may have read books in the past that have epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter, and they don't really address the epigraphs directly in the work. They're just kind of to give you a clue on the theme. This is not how you would use it in a literary analysis essay. You need to address the quote. Some of my Comp 1 students will sometimes go on Brainy Quotes and pull like an Albert Einstein quote or a Mother Teresa quote randomly and just stick it on top of the intro paragraph and not really address why it's there. So I just want to pull that off. You'll see that what I do is I have my epigraph here, and then I immediately start close reading it. So what would make for a good epigraph, if you're drawn to this kind of opening, something from the time period of your writing, another work by the same author, an actual quote from the literary work you're looking at. That's definitely a good possibility. I've certainly started papers like that before myself. Or something by another author that kind of treats the same theme. So I could have pulled a Philip Sidney quote here or a Christopher Marlowe quote if I wanted to find another example of melancholia and love. Or I could have done Thomas Wyatt's Whoso Lists to Hunt, or another Petrarchan type sonnet. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. Okay. This is called the hook. It's how you get the reader in. So after I've given the epigraph, I then close read the epigraph a little bit. And then I start to subtly switch to what's called the shared context. This is the background that the reader needs to know in order to eventually understand my thesis. This is why I asked you to kind of come up with a tentative thesis before you had started writing the paper, because you kind of need to know where you're going, even if you end up changing your thesis later. So I've got some background. I've talked about the love is disease trope. I talk about this character being something that Shakespeare uses in other works, not only in the sonnets, but also in plays. And then I kind of transition to Twelfth Night. In Twelfth Night, the playwright creates another Petrarchan lover in Duke Orsino, who pines away for the fair Olivia. Okay, and then I describe that. All of this is a background for the theme of my paper, which is that Viola needs to become this friend so that Orsino stops relating to women in this kind of Petrarchan way, and gets to know them. And that's the way that she wants to interact with him, is as a friend, as a male friend, if you will, and not as a Petrarchan worship object. Now, here's the tricky thing. We're supposed to create motivation for our thesis here in the intro paragraph. And so I have to be a little sneaky. I don't want to tip my hand to my thesis yet. I want to give the background, and then I want to problematize it. So if you'll see right here where I have said although, and I'm going to highlight him real quick, this is where I start to problematize the context. So right before that, I've been talking about Orsino persists in his lovesickness, but Viola encourages him to put it aside. And then I need to problematize. Although modern audiences may be surprised by Orsino's proposal immediately upon learning that Cesario is a woman, Shakespeare has been setting up this marriage to be a success from their first encounter. So that's why I'm like, here's Orsino, relating to Olivia as a Petrarchan lover, but that's not going to be how he really needs to relate to women. So I problematized. We often will signal this problem section with a transition word that just kind of clues the audience in. If I say although, I know I'm about to have a contrast. Another big one is however. That is a really, really common way to problematize. And that's probably what you see in the example paragraph on Richard Cory. That's on Canvas. You could use the word but. You don't necessarily have to use a transition word. You could say something like, the problem with this scenario is, to problematize if you'd like. So whatever kind of fits with your own personal style or the own ethos of the paragraph as it's kind of unfolding, that's what you do. But this is what's going to lay the groundwork for the thesis. We want in a literary analysis thesis to go beyond the surface level reading of the text and show the reader an insight, a deeper insight. And the deeper insight can only be kind of encountered through the close reading, through the secondary source material. We've got to bring in, this kind of deep thinking and analysis in order to get to the thesis. Now, you've already done that, and you're going to prove it to the reader in the body paragraphs. But in the introduction, you need to kind of show the reader, hey, you may have surface read this play one way and been kind of slightly bothered by the fact that the minute Orsino finds out Viola is a man, or is not a man, he wants to marry her. But really, you shouldn't be so bothered because this is what's happening. Okay, so that's what I'm doing in my intro. Okay, and then I get to my thesis. Now, I don't spend a whole lot of time. This isn't a super long intro paragraph. And I will say that some of you have these latter two aspects, like you have the problem and the thesis, but you don't lay the groundwork first or have a hook. Some of you jump from your hook right to your thesis without problematizing, and some of your papers still really need a truly argumentative thesis. So everybody's kind of in a different place here, and I did give you comments on your intro. The intro is the hardest paragraph to write, in my opinion, unless you just get suddenly inspired, which is not really something that often happens with this kind of writing. Unfortunately, it'd be wonderful if it did. So just be prepared to go back and read through your comments that I've made on your first draft. I probably have commented on your intro, even if it's to say your intro looks great. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about, that's kind of a general issue for a lot of you. Now, some of you did this just fine, so don't worry, is the role of topic sentences. Think about your whole paper is one big argument, and you use the quotes from the text, the literary text, and also the secondary sources to back up your argument. Your argument is prime. This has to do with American academic style. It is American academic style to be very direct, to tell the reader what you want them to think, and then to prove it. This is not the same as other kind of academic styles in other countries. And so if you're familiar with other academic systems, like an Asian system or a Latin American system, then they may find it insulting to kind of, beat the reader over the head with what the thesis is. And so just be aware if you're ever, kind of in that situation academically, or if you come from one of those backgrounds and you're kind of struggling with, why it should be like this, like, isn't that obvious? It's just American academic style. And so that's just something to keep in mind. For that reason, each topic sentence of each body paragraph needs to deliberately tell the reader why the paragraph is there. And it does that by referring back to the thesis in some way. So because my thesis here is that, and I'm just going to read the second half, or I'll read the whole thing. Viola's cross-dressing allows her to become Orsino's true friend, and thus in Twelfth Night, Shakespeare argues that if love is going to be fulfilling, lovers must abandon Petrarchan love melancholia and create the kind of passionate friendship with their potential spouse that Renaissance men enjoyed with each other. So I've got several ideas floating around here: the Petrarchan love melancholia, passionate friendship, and friendship of a spouse. So I'm going to address little pieces of that thesis in each body paragraph, and I need to use my topic sentences to clue my readers in to which little piece of the thesis I'm going to be proving. So the first thing I need to do is prove that Petrarchan idealism is not glorified in Twelfth Night. So you see here that my first sentence of my first body paragraph does that. Twelfth Night demonstrates that Petrarchan idealism is harmful and should be abandoned in favor of friendship. Then I go about proving. I'm not using any quotes in my first sentences. That's something common thing that students will do. You don't want to jump in with a quote. You want to tell the reader what the paragraph is about first and then put in your quotes. It's very deductive how you're laying out. So you're laying out the theory and then you're proving it. Whereas the process you used to write the paper was probably more inductive reasoning in terms of how you came up with your idea and your thesis. But now when you're laying it out for a reader, you need to use deductive reasoning to kind of lay out your arguments. Okay, I'm just going to highlight a few formatting things. If I've got a play or a poem, if I'm longer than 2 lines of a play or poem, I want to block quote it. And you see that for MLA, it's fairly easy. I just tab in and I continue the rest of the paragraph here. Make sure that you're tabbing in to start each paragraph, because if you don't, it can be very difficult for your reader to tell when one paragraph ends and another begins. So that's just a little formatting note. I noticed some of you were not tabbing in. You can see how I'm using my quotes. Most of you are doing a pretty good job with your quotes. A few of you are not embedding them, which means starting this sentence with your own words. And so think about, do I need to use the whole entire quote, the full sentence, or can I just use part of it? Even if you just put a tag on that says something like according to Jones, and then give your quote, it's best to embed, because that way, again, your argument is primal. You're not just throwing a bunch of quotes from other people in there. You're giving the quotes in service of your own argument. Okay. All right. So I've got body paragraph, body paragraph. I have pictures in here. That's just because of the type of thing that I was doing. You do not need to put pictures in. Nobody's doing really a topic that requires that. If you were, then it would be good to put the pictures in. And you'll see I put captions in. Okay. More block quoting here. If you're quoting a prose work and it goes on longer than 4 lines, then you'll need to block quote. But for poetry and plays, if it's longer than 2, we usually like people to block quote. Okay. One last thing to talk about, and that's your conclusion. This is another place where people feel cheesy, because you're like, well, I just, restate my argument. And then what do? It's like 3 sentences long. It's true that you need to restate your argument, but you also need to open up, expand your argument a little bit. Don't go crazy. Don't, drop a bombshell there in the last paragraph, but you can kind of, extend the conclusion out a little bit. Now, the easiest way is to just bring up another kind of issue related to your thesis that's in the play, the poem, whatever you're looking at, just to kind of show that there are more things that you could talk about. I could have easily done several different things here. I did not, because of the length of the paper, I did not get into how Olivia's being a Petrarchan lover. I did not get into how Viola is handling her love sickness. Well, she's not lovesick. She's handling it in a different way. But that's something I could have talked about in the body of the paper if the paper were longer, or in this paper in the conclusion. So if you had something that you didn't have time or room in the paper to get to, putting it in the conclusion is really cool. So in my conclusion for this paper, I said, Orsino's Petrarchan condition may be improving, but he's not yet totally cured. Because we see near the end of the play, as soon as he realizes that Cesario is Viola, he says, when in other habits you are seen, Orsino's mistress and his fancy's queen. So here he is using this really fancy language again, idealizing the woman that he loves. So he's not totally cured, but at least he has a basis for his love right now. And then that helps me talk about how, this whole Petrarchan and friendship thing, it got mixed up in the main body of the play because it's Twelfth Night and it's a world topsy-turvy, and now order is returning. But I needed that chaos in the middle of the play in order to show Orsino that the woman he really needs to love is the woman he thinks is a man. Okay, so you see in the last few sentences of the conclusion, that's where I restate my thesis and restate my argument. So think about in your own paper doing the same thing. Just a few notes on works cited. A lot of you your works cited look fine. Some of you have some issues. So I've tried to put a variety, when I was doing this example paper, I tried to put a variety of different types of sources. So for example, I've quoted Shakespeare from the anthology and the sonnet from the anthology. So this is the template that you would use. I've got some books here. I've got the introduction to a book, and then I've got some sources that I pulled off of college databases. And here, the Patterson and the Shaltwick and the Lindheim and the Charles. Those are all digital sources that I pull. And so just, be aware. I am fully cognizant that people use EasyBib. I also am fully cognizant that a lot of people don't know how to use EasyBib. And even sometimes if you grab the citation from the library citation generator, it's off a little bit. So some people had some citations that were not in MLA. They looked like they were in Turabian or APA or something like that. So just, it's not the most high level thinking thing in the world, but just please get your formatting right, because you don't want to lose points on that. Okay, there is a resource on Canvas for you that lays out, and let's see if I can pull it up here so I can show you here I'm in my studio. Let me get to the modules that lays out more information on how to write the introduction. And it's here under essays, intro, paragraph, information, and example. And here I kind of talk through more a loose guide for how to do it. I talk through the parts: hooked, shared context, problem, and thesis. And then I give this 196 word intro paragraph, an example intro paragraph for the poem Richard Cory, which you can find there. Again, this was something that I did with my Comp 1 students, and they kind of wrote it with me. So is it the most awesome intro paragraph ever? No, but it is a intro paragraph that lays out the kind of steps that you need to do to create motivation for your thesis. Please, please, please come see me during my office hours on either Friday morning from 11 to 12 or on Tuesday afternoon from 3 to 4. Your paper isn't due until midnight or 11:59 on Wednesday, July 8th. So you still have plenty of time. If those times don't work for you and you'd like to chat with me in person at a different time, just let me know. Send me an email and we can set up a time, especially in the time of COVID, restricted movement and, kind of the activity levels that we're all having. I'm at home a lot, so there are times that I can meet with you outside of those prescribed office hours. All right, you guys take care, and I look forward to reading your final drafts.